let's talk about it.
Hello and welcome back to Thicc Radio, the award-winning podcast where we talk about gaining, fetishism, and everything in their orbit. I'm James.
And I'm Tim, so let's get into it. Today we're continuing our series of dinner table talks. We've got a few guests with us, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves one by one.
Hi everyone, my name is Phil, aka Blubrboy, and been in the gaming community for quite some time, probably my whole adult life, but happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Gene. I am uncannyphoenix on Grommr. I have also been in the scene for a few years, not as long as Phil, but a few years. Very excited to be here as well.
Hi there, I'm Aaron, and my name is fattanetta on Grommr. I'm probably the youngest out of everybody here, so I'm still fairly new to the whole scene, but I'm so happy to be here.
Wonderful. We're very excited to have you all, and we were talking a little bit about this before the recording started to roll, but we really think this is going to be a very important episode. We're touching on some really some deeper subjects today. For the nature of today's episode, can each of you please share with us how you're differently abled and how this manifests in your daily life?
I'll go ahead and start. So I use a power chair. I started using that when I was diagnosed with back issues in 2019. And I have a curious story about that. We'll get into that a little bit later, but that is my disability.
I am a diabetic. I also have a degenerative neurological condition, and I have some mobility challenges due to a series of surgeries that I had to have on my foot, on one of my feet. I use what's called a walking crutch for day-to-day getting around, which is where your leg kind of balances on your knee, and then you have sort of the rest of your leg sticks out behind, and I can walk on that. I also use a power chair or scooter when I'm out and about in the world.
The things that I have to go through it's a list of things. I have autism, ADHD, a condition called Marfan syndrome, which is a heart condition, and it affects all the different ligaments in my body and the muscle tissues. And because of that, I'm also partially blind. So what I have to use is a lot of different magnifiers. Some things I cannot read, so I need assistance. And as for my heart-related issues, I have to take a variety of different medications to keep them under control.
Thank you everyone for sharing. I mean, I'll disclose here, as someone who I have not been diagnosed with anything by my doctor, I don't know that I've necessarily experienced what I think could be considered a true access issue in the world. I've recently begun a journey with medication. I'm on metazapine, which has been wonderful in relation to my mental health journey, especially as of late. We live in a very interesting time in the world where there's a lot going on, and the metaz helps me to remain calmer amidst a lot that is going on. Tim, what about for yourself? Have you been experiencing any particular intersections of that note recently?
I mean, this is something that I'm constantly aware of. I don't have anything that limits my mobility or my freedom of doing anything, right? I guess the closest that I would have to that would be sleep apnea. I have to sleep with a CPAP machine, otherwise I could potentially smother to death in my sleep. I'm not 100% convinced that would actually happen, but anyway. But I am aware that as I continue on this journey, things like this could develop. And some of it's going to be genetics, some of it's going to be lifestyle. And I just have to always be aware that this could happen, and that's why I like conversations like this, because I think so many people dive into this community with all of the fantasy, and then they don't ever think, or they'll picture themselves in their head like, I want to be 400 pounds, but then they don't think about what could happen as they start to reach those extreme weights and things that they might be genetically predisposed to that will start to flare up at that weight.
I think that point that you bring up there, Tim, is probably one of the first and most potent points, I think, that comes up in this type of conversation. There's certainly no lack of verve and excitement, shall we say, in the community when it comes to gaining and when it comes to achieving what we see as, very specific markers for weight gain goals. Insofar as I know that there are plenty of people who would view the need for a CPAP to be an achievement. I've spoken with people in the past who've confessed that they are very excited about the notion of developing diabetes. For them, that's a reference point of achievement. And I do wonder sometimes a question of how we should navigate those concepts, which ultimately I think does come down to everyone's grown. People are going to live life on their terms. If that's what's applicable for them, go for gold. But I do think part of what you're saying there, Tim, is there is a lot of jumping in headfirst without necessarily knowing how to swim, if that's perhaps a direction to take that analogy. I want to put this out there to you all, especially, for Phil and for Jean. You all have mentioned that you've been in the community for a bit of a longer period of time than some of us others. That notion of access as far as gaining is concerned, has that ever been a point of discussion or advice that's been offered up to either of you all on the gaining journey?
I've had a long time to look at gaining before I even started gaining. And I've had a group of friends through this whole experience, and I'm really keen on building your own community. It helps stay sane in the gainer world because we get so many non-gainer messages from society. And in my hardcore gainer group of friends, we have always discussed what happens when you lose mobility and the desire for that, because that is a marker of success for many of us in how less able we are and can do things, where we fit in society and making ourselves not fit specifically. And, for myself, I had already picked out my power chair years before I needed one, just because for my attraction, I've always wanted to get to that point of needing a power chair or scooter. And it was surprising to me when I actually got to that point and the doctor said, this is the list, and it's a list of things that is wrong with my back. And I realized, okay, I'm going to be actually needing that chair a lot sooner than I thought, because I was only in my 400s and I thought I wasn't going to need that until I got around 600 or 700 pounds. So, it's kind of like achievement achieved, unexpectedly so, but because it really just kind of tied into my attraction, my desire for being so fat. I ordered that chair the night I got home from the doctor. So it was something that I was so ready for, and it was such a personal milestone for me. So that's kind of my little intro into how I got here, why I use it, and why I need it, actually.
I think, James, it's interesting the point that you brought up too in regards to the, or lack of a better term, fetishization of that disability. And I think for a lot of gainers, and I've seen this over the years, that there are a lot of folks for whom it is a fetish to lose the mobility, and there are a lot of folks for whom it's just, well, that is a consequence of, if I continue to increase my body mass, this is a thing that's going to happen. What I would encourage in the case of a lot of, whether it be that they're younger gainers or folks who are just starting on their gaining journey, regardless of ages, that is a thing that you need to think about beyond what gets you off. You really do have to consider, because for the majority of folks, gainers or not, able-bodied folks tend to not realize how very temporary being able-bodied can be, and how you are going to have to live the rest of your life, however long that is, dependent on these devices, dependent on these treatments, depending on these medications. And for some folks, that's absolutely fine, and they have weighed that. But I think, if you're in your early 20s and you're 110 pounds and you're saying, well, I want to be a 500-pound, immobile blob, well, that's great because it gets you off. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if you're being serious about that, that is something that you do need to consider. And honestly, too, for a lot of us, some of that, even gaining aside, losing mobility is something that just happens with age for a lot of folks. You don't necessarily have to be fat to be disabled. I mean, luckily, a lot of us here are, and that's great. But there are a lot of folks who just truly don't realize, oh, I could take a bad slip at my job at 25 years old, and then I'm in a wheelchair for the rest of my life. You don't know. And these are things that you should consider. I don't think it's something that really gets talked about a lot in the gaining circles outside of, as I mentioned, for lack of a better word, the fetishization. A lot of folks talk about like, oh, achievement unlocked, I need a CPAP, or whatever the case happens to be. One thing that I will say as a diabetic that kind of makes me a little bit insane, and I see it a lot on Grommr, is I'm going to eat this until I become diabetic, or I ate so much I'm diabetic now, or whatever. It's like, I understand what you're doing. That is ableist. Food does not make you diabetic. That is a very complicated combination of genetics, family history. Diet can certainly play a factor. Weight can certainly play a factor. Weight also cannot play a factor. I know plenty of gainers who are well over 400 pounds that have a blood sugar that I would literally kill for. So, the whole idea of, I ate myself diabetic, I get what you're doing, but it's not cute if you actually are diabetic.
Right. And it's just, like in my case, when it comes to like what I have to deal with, I was always a really skinny kid, very similar to how James was. And I always had very high blood pressure and, a lot of issues that revolved around that. And my aorta was more dilated from birth. So it actually made absolutely no difference, that my weight was, for a lot of people, was considered underweight. And I ended up going on different medications and things like that to help alleviate that over the years. And some of them have been, as a side effect, given me, weight gain. Like a lot of my initial weight gain was completely unintentional. And it was just because of various medications. But, they helped me with like dealing with my heart and like my autism, things like that. Not all of them, though. That's the other side to a lot of those kind of things too, is like a lot of these, psychiatrists were very experimental, and they're very, they don't really know what the medication is going to do to a person. And a lot of them are just, trying to see like if it will work, what the side effects are. But yeah, so it really doesn't make a difference what your weight is. Like I have a lot of people in my family who are very thin and they have heart issues, and some of them have diabetes and they're way thinner than me. So you're absolutely correct when it comes to it. All just depends on the person's genetics.
There was so much here to unpack, really. First of all, Gene, you mentioned the fetishization, and this is, I think, one of the first points where access and gaining cross over very firmly. So many of us who gain weight don't do the work to unpack our internalized fat phobia. And we should literally, every single one of us, be doing that. And I think there are a lot of people who don't see the issue with that, because in their mind they go, well, fat turns me on, therefore how could this be bad? I'm horny. What do you mean you've got a problem with how I'm speaking to you? I'm a gainer, you're a gainer, therefore you must exist in this realm for the same purpose as me, for the same reason as me. You are here to get off, and I've decided that you're very sexy, so therefore you must make me come. That's your job. What do you mean you don't want to do that? What do you mean you don't consent to it? But I'm horny. What do you mean? It's a very interesting dialogue to begin to unpick and unpack. And I think this is something really important, both in regards to gaining, but also into unpicking the ways in which we often infantilize people with disabilities, because we decide that with fatness, oh, well, the way you get treated is because you're fat. Same thing with someone with any number of access issues. We decide, oh, well, you are quote unquote incapable, therefore I will talk down to you. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm being kind, I'm being considerate by, oh, do you need a hand? Like, it's just a very interesting, people don't see the connection, and people don't realize like what a cunt, what a prick they're being, and they just go, well, I'm just being nice. Well, what problem do they have? It's a very strange thing.
Well, what I was going to say is what I find interesting is that I don't really notice this with younger queer people or gay men, but I do find this in older gay men, like my age and older. There is a bit more of like this sexual obsession tone with it. And I found this inside the community and outside. Because like in the pup community, I knew somebody who like everything about being a puppy was sex related with him. And there was just, it was almost as if he just never stopped being hypersexual. And I don't know if that's because that's what his designation was, or if that's just what he felt he had to do. But I've found this in the gainer community with guys that have like wanted to intentionally trash their bodies and are excited when they get blood results that like have negative things on them, like their cholesterol is up and their triglycerides are up, and they're happy that they're kind of like sticking it to the health system or something like that. And while I admit that I can find that there's an eroticism in that, to me, I don't get too into it because it's not practical, and it's, I guess maybe I don't like giving up that amount of control. But that could also be the reason why it's erotic for them, is they are completely abandoning control over their own life and body.
Hmm. I mean, I think that brings in a big difference. You know, Phil, you had mentioned even before you'd reached such a size, you were already so specific in knowing, no, I will need a power chair. This is the power chair that I want. So I think there is like a bit of a difference between people who simply find that arousal and people who find the pursuit in that. Because I think it's also a pertinent conversation to bring up after you've had your jollies, had your fun, and you clean yourself off and you stand in front of the mirror and you see reflected a body that is different than the one you had when you started this. When you see a body that, whether you're willing to admit that you get treated differently or not, is a body that gets treated differently by the workplace, by your family, by your friends. That's the unpacking that needs to happen. And I think it's through that, like what Phil experienced, where you can then go, okay, if I know I'm going to get to that size and I know I'm good with a power chair, this is what I'm going to go for. And then for this is going to be my approach, rather than the sort of drizzled in just constant sex, you know? Although I did want to reference here, Jane, you had mentioned a lot of those young guys saying that they want to get really big. And I think it was a Paging Dr. Gaynor we did last year, where the question was like, oh, I have concerns about my health. And Dr. Gaynor's response was, this sounds like it's coming from someone who's under 200 pounds, and I recommend you try getting fat first.
Oh my God.
I mean, listen, no shade to the baby gainers among us, but listen, I thought that was a fair shake of the sauce bottle, can't lie.
And to add on to what you were just saying, James, as we were talking about the preparing for that and the fetishization of that, one thing that you do have to remember too is when you are in a chair, that is another aspect, whether you are or aren't fat. When you're in a chair, you are going to be looked at differently. You are going to be addressed differently, and you are going to be treated differently. As I'm sure Bill could assess, in a lot of cases, public events with crowds are a nightmare. It can be very, very difficult to even just navigate a crowded store when you're in a chair, because people are generally oblivious if they notice you at all. Plus you're generally below their eye line because you're seated. And these are the kind of things that I think when a lot of the, as you said, no shade to the baby gainers, but when you're saying I want to be 500 pounds and I want to be in a wheelchair and I want to this and that, okay, are you ready for that? Are you ready to struggle because Target is difficult for you to go into the store and buy things for yourself?
And not only Target, it is going into a bookstore with narrow aisles. Any boutique store, I have often had to back myself out, backwards, which can be tricky. When I find I'm down an aisle and there's no way out, I have to go backwards because it's impossible to turn around. It really is a reality. And as you get fat, I want to address the concept of planning that you mentioned, in that I think it's important to have a plan, and to just move forward in gaining without a plan can lead to some really unpleasant consequences. I found out when I got my chair, I had to realize, well, how do I get it to where I'm going? So I had to get a new vehicle. And then I tried the manual ramp, which is this 100-pound folding, Goliath, and it was not going to work for many reasons. So I had to send my van in to have it refitted to carry a power chair, which was very expensive. And I thought, well, I'm grateful that I can tap into savings that I have, but how does the average person without these kind of resources make this work? It is not cheap, and it is a lot of work, and you have to really want it to make it work, and you have to plan it well enough, meaning your life, so that you can enjoy it for, and the fact that you need it for those of us that do. It's a lot of work, and you have to have some kind of plan to make your life work when you get fatter. And for me, that also includes all of the other health stuff. I'm also diabetic. I have a whole box of medications that I go through in a day. And, I meet with my doctor, and I want to survive to enjoy my fat life. And that means I watch my blood sugar, I watch my blood pressure, I take all of those meds to make this life work. And it's important that people hear that, because yes, you can dream about being 1,000 pounds and all that comes with that. But the reality is, you need to live day by day to enjoy it, and to just throw caution to the wind. In the moment, it may be hot, but then 10 minutes later, you need to continue living your life. You need to, be able to use a restroom. Again, at home, I remodeled my bathroom to make it work for a big fat fatty. And again, I'm lucky that I planned and I've saved to be able to do that. But often that's not the case. So all of these things take some planning and some effort to make your fat life work, so that you can enjoy being fat in your chair wherever you are, and getting your chair where you need to be, controlling your health stuff while enjoying that life.
Oh yeah, I would have to agree on that too. I mean, even in my circumstances, because of my blood pressure, there's certain things I have to be very wary of, and I can't just, just eat like a ton of sugar and just engross myself in that all the time, because it can cause different spikes in with my, my heart rate, and different, issues with that, where it's just like I could potentially have to be hospitalized. So, or, the consumption of caffeine, in my case too, is something I have to be wary of. Like, what has caffeine in it? What's going to have so much sugar? How's this is going to affect my heart rate? And what do I need to do to help make sure that if I'm going to gain, I do it in a very conscious, caring way for myself too. And you were absolutely correct when saying that it's something that takes a lot of planning. I can't gain very fast because of these conditions. So for me, it's a very slow process, but that's fine. It's something that I've, come to terms with my body, and being able to regulate it so that I can stay healthy, but also achieve my goals of where I want to be with gaining.
I do want to add on to what we're talking about right now, in that there is a fine line, I believe, in living your fat life and not putting health as a virtue to be achieved. I think it's important to avoid this ableist and health-oriented focus, because yes, I want to enjoy my fat life, but I am not downplaying the unhealthy aspects as something that is negative. For me, I know what works. I have an equation to make my life work, but I'm not saying being unhealthy is a bad thing. I'm saying, for me, health is not a virtue that I think should outweigh everything else. And I know that for me to stay alive and function, I need, certain things in place. But I think so often we hear, and I mean the royal we, that it's okay to be fat as long as you're healthy. And I think that's bullshit. I don't think that you need to be healthy to be happy. I think you need to find what works to make your life function. I think there's a certain erotic disregard for health that many of us embrace to varying degrees, but that being a healthy fat man, I think, is a crock of shit. I think you should find what works for you, and not play into this ableist notion of, well, it's okay to be fat as long as you can walk, or as long as you're healthy, or as long as you don't get diabetes. Then it's a bad thing. I think, well, for maybe that person, it passed their threshold of comfort and where they want to be. And that's fine. But that doesn't work for everyone. I think we have to find what works for each of us individually.
I think that's so well said, Bill. Thank you for that. And just to further build on what Phil was saying, I think, the planning aspect is something that truly, truly cannot be understated, especially for the Americans. Health is largely a concept of luck and privilege in America. Just pick any one of any of our conditions, any of the things we have in common or not. Medications are not inexpensive, even if you have fairly good insurance. Being diabetic is expensive. You hear all the time in the news and things of the price of insulin, the price of insulin. Yes, insulin is very expensive. You know what's even more expensive than insulin? The instruments to deliver it. If you use an insulin pumps are very expensive. I spend 10 times more on the pods for my insulin pump delivery than I do on the insulin. And that's something that I've never heard that spoken about publicly. If part of your fetish is to be unhealthy, good for you. I have no problem with that at all. Everybody's different, but you have to be prepared for the things, you may have to sacrifice other things just simply financially, because wheelchairs are expensive. Diabetic equipment is expensive. Medication is expensive. That's a factor that you don't really hear talked about a lot.
Oh, absolutely. Being somebody who's, partially blind, its accessibility has been extraordinarily hard, and places like Ohio, they have like, the bus system and things like that, but it's not great. So it's like, for somebody like me who wants to even go and get food, it's a challenge. I have to really arrange things and find, a means to be able to even get it. And that's definitely something that is really never talked about. Like they just assume like, oh, well, you have a car, right? No, I've never been able to drive. I've never had that ability to do that. And, people very much overlook it here in the States because it's like, our country is very much built around using vehicles and cars. So it's just like, you know, not only is that expensive to maintain one just in general for any person, but it's like trying to find a means to be able to travel from point A to point B when you're somebody who can't see, well enough to drive is horrible. And I wish they could do something to change that because it's like, some cases, like I can't even get food. I just have to, try to, find ways to, make amends or, make arrangements with people to help me even get, to the store. And so I just, I hope that it's like eventually that's something that can be fixed for people, who are visually impaired. But as of right now, it's not great, but hopefully a learning process for others.
But these are the realities of people who have disabilities, people who have access needs, is that our society and world is not built for the needs of those things. Circling back to countless points here, it's not to shade people who want to pursue, what you might term as an unhealthy approach to gaining, because if it's right for you, that's fantastic, go and do that. But it is always best to do things from an informed perspective. For some people who approach gaining, I think sometimes there can be a question of, is there even a non-junk food way to gain weight? Because sometimes it feels like that's all the conversation is. And it's like Phil and Jean have been saying, sometimes it's planning that's involved. Sometimes it is being a little bit more forethinking about the foods that we're eating and how we're going about things to tailor our gaining journey to be whatever we need it to be for us. To bring it back to that point as well, if anyone has not checked out the Go Invo Determinants of Health, that's a fantastic little resource that really unpicks the nebulous concept that is health. And I think mathematically they work it out that diet and exercise only impacts between 6 to 10% of our nebulous blob of health. More percentage overall is determined by your genetics and by the location you live in than is determined by the food you put in your body and the amount of exercise you are or are not getting. And I think this also brings around to a point that I think, Jean, you were saying before, is that, a question of access loss is actually a statement of inevitability, because actually, as you age, you begin to lose access to things. Because of your age, you begin to develop disorders or medical situations or things that would require you to need help and things like that. And so really, you being fat doesn't actually change anything, really. The question of, like, much like you were saying, Phil, this ableist idea of like, oh, you're allowed to be fat so long as you're healthy. Baby, ill health is an inevitability. And depending on how you frame the concept of disability, that might be someone's idea of ill health. Like, all of this very fat-phobic rhetoric, when we point to fat people, we go, why are fat people bad and unhealthy? Oh, because they've all got diabetes and they're a burden on the healthcare system. Okay, so they're human beings that, even if that was true, these human beings require assistance. So, like, what, everybody who's in a wheelchair, you're just going to turn around and be like, ew, you need wheels, screw you, and then, like, that's it. Like, no. That would be utter madness.
And yet there are a lot of folks who do literally believe that, even if they don't want to say it out loud.
I was going to say, it's like, it's sad to me how people, will view you so differently, because in a lot of cases, like what you've been explaining, James, and, Gene and Phil, is that, people, they're so judgmental just even on a physical appearance, of a person. And, they don't, they don't think about what it's like to be, in that situation either, when it's just like, nobody really wants to get to know like what you're having to deal with. They just see you as like, oh, you're an inconvenience, or oh, whatever. And I'm like, no, I'm sorry that I have, like, these things that maybe don't appeal to you, but it's like, this is my life. I'm trying to, navigate it the best, I can, and make sure I'm happy and fulfilling what I need to do. Maybe it doesn't line up with like the general populace's, interpretation of happiness. But it's like, sorry, it's like, screw you, I'm doing what I can.
I would be curious to ask for everyone. I don't know people's experiences with going to Grommr or larger gainer events, chub chaser events, bear events, everything in that nebulous queer space. Do you find those events accessible?
Have found in my experience that entirely depends on the location they're held at. I will say I have found less ableism amongst people in the gainer community than in the general populace, but, and I'm sure both Aaron and Phil probably could speak to a similar experience, most people who are able-bodied really don't tend to take disability into consideration when it comes to events. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean, it doesn't impact them, so it's not a thing they think about. It never enters their mind. So, if a Grommr is held at, say, a brewery, for example, they're not necessarily going to think, is there a curb to get into that location? Are there stairs? Is there a ramp? Are there automatic doors? Are there bathrooms that are accessible to people? And in the case of, I use the example of a brewery because frankly, a lot of them are not. If you choose a large enough restaurant that is probably a chain, probably has been around for a while, yes, chances are they have all the ADA compliance worked out. But, a smaller, like a family restaurant, it might be too crowded for the chair to get in there. There may be a curb that prevents, well, I guess I'm going to sit here on the sidewalk. You guys have fun. These are things that you do have to take into account. Now, I will say, I've only been on one, but like, for example, when my boyfriend and I went on the Grommr of the Seas a couple of years ago, while the ship itself, for the most part, was accessible, the group that we were with was super accommodating and everybody was really helpful. And if there was a space where it was just, I can't get in there, our group was very comfortable going, oh, well, then we just won't do that. That's fine. We'll go do something else that you can do. And that's great. But when you exist in public with a disability, you are going to run across a lot of circumstances of, oh, I guess I just can't go in there. Phil raised this point of, like there are times when you have to back yourself out of a tight aisle in a store or something. A couple of months ago, my boyfriend and I were out of town and we went by, anybody that knows me, I'm a big toy nerd. We went to a vintage toy store. Great store, terrific staff, great selection. My wheelchair barely made it down the aisles and I was knocking things off everywhere I went. There was no room to turn. And that was without the store even being crowded. If that store had been full of people, I just couldn't have gone into it. And these are things that people just kind of don't take into account because it never enters their mind.
I have to echo what you're saying, Gene, in that it is based on the location. And even though places have been in business for a while, that doesn't necessarily mean it's easy to navigate when you're in a wheelchair or a power chair. I have been in several restaurants, current, modern, up-to-date restaurants, that the bathroom, getting from the table to the bathroom, sometimes is an impossibility. There's one restaurant, as a quick example, where the restroom, which is fully accessible in my power chair, but the way to get there, there's a bar, 360 bar, people all around it. And if someone's sitting in a bar chair, I can't get by them. So in order to get to the bathroom, each person had to get off their stool, move it in so that I can get down the aisle to the bathroom. And then there's the return trip. So, things like that don't really affect you until you're in a chair and it looks like a sea of impossibility to get you where you need to go. So it does really matter on the venue. A recent trip to the Queen Mary here in Long Beach, a place that I love and cherish, but it's old. It was built in the 30s. And even though they've updated the restrooms, my chair can't fit in any of the restrooms. I found out on a recent trip, and I'm not going to sit there and cause a complaint that this historic museum can't accommodate me, but it does make me think, what am I going to do in the future if I need to use the restroom in that place? So I'm probably going to go less. And that's just a reality. And that's something that when you're in a wheelchair or power chair, you have to begin to look at what is possible for me to enjoy the experience to the fullest. And it does take a lot of planning. Am I going to fit in that venue?
I learned very quickly too that there's a very large difference between technically accessible and actually accessible. There are plenty of public spaces where, a building may be considered accessible, or it's a modern building, or it's a chain that's been around for a while, and you think, oh, well, they're fully ADA. And that is true. But like the example Phil used of the bar is a great example. That bathroom and the path to it is technically accessible. But when you factor in the real world factors of, what if somebody has a stroller in the aisle, or, there are folks on bar stools, like, yes, technically I can get in there. Realistically, no, I can't.
Right. I mean, venue absolutely plays a huge part in it. And it's like, for me, it's even just getting there. Just finding a way or means to get there is a challenge. Because, let's say they decide to have a venue somewhere that's kind of, a bit out of the way. There's no way I can go. There's absolutely no way I can even attend. Because unless it's like on bus route or, a means of transportation that can go out that distance, I'm completely out of luck.
Right.
And a lot of business like bars and things like that are hard for me to be in anyways because it's extremely stimulating for me because of the autism and ADHD. So it causes me in some cases panic attacks, and most people don't think about that at all. They don't, think like, oh well, everybody should be fine because I'm okay with this, and it's like no, it's like certain club scenes, certain loud venues and things like that. I don't particularly do well in because it just makes me extremely anxious. And because it's not visually something that people can actually see, unless it's like, maybe I'm shaking or something, they just assume like, oh, what's wrong with you? It's like, why are you acting so weird? And it's like, well, I'm overstimulated. And a lot of places, previous jobs I've had were very, cruel to me because of those reasons, because I may not visually look like I have, a mental disorder, whatever that would even be. It's just, they just don't even try to understand what my situation is. So yeah, it's like, for me, I would rather go to a park or, a nice restaurant that's, a bit on the quiet side for things. But, that's not always the case with what people want to do or what they think is going to be, good for everybody. A lot of the time I just have to mask and just, pretend I'm okay.
That's a really powerful point, to say that there are times where you have to pretend that you're okay. Because the ultimate feeling that you receive is that people either don't care or that people aren't willing to really have a conversation about that point. And I really hope that listeners really take this in here, because backing up for a sec to that point of, a lack of access is an inevitability for the majority of us. Like, as we age, as we grow, we will find ourselves as people who require either assistance or gear or medication or just things to help us have access in the world. And much like I think all of you all have really come through today to explain, is that people just assume in their mind, like, oh, there must be resources. There must be things for people. I don't see it, but I just assume it's there. Like, you already know that once you size out of 2XL underwear, you pretty much have to go to, like, the big and tall section of an online store. Like, you already know that once it stops being accessible in the mainstream, like, it almost disappears entirely. So, come back to that point you keep saying here, Phil, about planning. I think that's very, very pertinent. I actually want to put to you here for a sec, Tim. As a nurse who's worked with the elderly, a number of those individuals are going to have access and healthcare needs, right?
Yeah.
So, like, how much of that is just kind of straightforward, and how much of that is, like, people find themselves in those situations and go, oh, well, I don't know what I'm doing. I didn't know about any of this. This is all a bit of a mystery to me.
I think that's most people, though, because insurance in the United States is a complete mess. I mean, no one knows what covers what. And every year, these companies come out with things that they don't cover anymore. All of a sudden, you're expected to pay more out of pocket. So I guess when it comes to, like, the bigger you get and the kind of access you'll have, we've talked many times before about how most doctors will just dismiss any problems you have as being weight related as soon as they see your BMI. And you're not going to be taken as seriously as you should be most of the time, and that's unfortunate. And there's so many people that the medical world just immediately dismisses, like, one thing and another, and medicine is discriminatory, and it shouldn't be. But the larger you get, the more you're going to face that. So just, that's something I think most people don't think about.
I add on to that, Tim. I think it's important as we get fatter to realize what you just said, that we're not going to be taken as seriously with our medical providers, which is why I'm a huge advocate for advocating for yourself. I think we're so used to telling our doctor, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, and following their guidance. We need to learn to be more participatory in our healthcare. We need to be able to advocate for more insulin with our doctors than the usual prescription, with my own perspective, and that, this is what I need for my healthcare. And yes, doctor, I know you're saying that you only want to prescribe this much, but for me to be comfortable in my life, I need more. I need what's appropriate for me to be healthy and happy. And, taking 2 units of insulin after a meal is not going to be okay. I can take up to 60 after a meal, and I do that, and I'll maintain my A1C, doctor, but I need this amount, and I insist that you work with me on that. We need to be able to tell our doctors what we need and not be afraid of the doctor because they are doctors, and realize that doctors are human beings and they have their own prejudices as well. And if you don't have a doctor that will work with you, find another. I have gone through several physicians to get to the one that I found through the NAFA website. Thank you, NAFA. And that's the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance, for people who are not familiar. Find a physician that will work with you to maintain your health where you're at, not one that's going to continue to insist that you lose weight. Every year when I have my checkup, my physician tells me, because I am contracted through your health plan, we need to talk about your weight for 30 seconds. and he tells me what he needs to every year. And I say, thank you, doctor, let's move on. So, you have to be an advocate for yourself and not just be a passive consumer of medical care if you want to live the life that you want.
Self-advocacy is definitely a thing, especially when you're disabled, that you will learn very, very quickly. Phil is exactly right. And I know, for example, like for me, I moved a year ago to a completely different part of the country. And, I went through the whole process of finding new doctors. And like, for example, when I went to my new endocrinologist to have my diabetes looked at, as regular to keep my prescriptions going and everything, I very firmly said, one of the first things I told her was, I'm aware that I'm fat. I'm okay with that. And I am not interested in Ozempic or Trulieve, Trubidia, whatever the thing that's being pushed currently is, we're going to slide right on past that because I'm not interested. And she is great. And I was very fortunate that she was like, oh, absolutely, not a problem at all. Keep it pumping. And, and that was great. But I have had doctors who were like, well, we're going to give you this. And you have to stop and say, I need you to tell me exactly what that is, what it does, what is it going to do to me? How am I going to feel on it? I'm not interested in weight loss medication, especially right now, because a lot of weight loss medications are actually diabetic medications that are being overprescribed for other people. There is actually a shortage in a lot of areas for Ozempic because people are taking it for weight loss. That is a diabetes medication, and that, but you do learn you have to speak up for yourself. Phil's exactly right. They have their own prejudices. And unfortunately, medical fat phobia, I think we all know, is very much a thing.
Oh yeah. I mean, I've dealt with my fair share of prejudice before with doctors too. I mean, psychiatrist I originally went to see to help me with my autism, but it was an experimental drug. He didn't even really know what it was going to do to me personally. So, and navigating the healthcare system is a challenge here in the US. It absolutely is. They don't tell you any guidelines on how to find anything. And you really do, like, Phil was saying, and Gene as well, that you have to be your own advocate. You have to, really push it to be able to find, something that's going to work for you. And that's included with insurance. It's like for me to get on the insurance, I'm currently on it took years. It took years to find it. And nobody told me how to do it. I just had to navigate through, job and family services. And I think everybody, here knows how much of a hot mess that really is. And, I was definitely picked and prodded apart from different doctors throughout my life too, because of my size and, them telling me that, oh, well, you need to be at this particular weight count, and not realizing it was, due to medication in the first place that was supposed to help me with, like, other issues. You have to really find somebody who's going to work with you, not against you. So that way you can find the best route.
It's a bitch, isn't it? It's funny because whenever we talk about the state of education in the United States, and we know it's pretty bad and it's going to get worse if certain people have their way with it, but it's like they started taking out all of these life skill classes that they would teach you in high school, yet because all these are frivolous, we need to stick to the STEM stuff. But it's like, what would have been really helpful for me in high school? Teach me how to fill out a W-2. Teach me how to do my taxes. Teach me something practical so that
Right.
so that I have some kind of, or teach me how insurance works. Give me some skill for going out in the world, because there's a bunch of shit that people just don't tell you. They just expect you to figure it out like they did and suffer through it, and maybe even do it wrong several times before you finally get it right. And I've never understood that about our society.
No, I mean, it's just like they don't see how it really can affect, people, especially people with mental disabilities too. It's like, fills me with so much anxiety to have to go on the phone and try to, navigate that with these people. I'm like, I don't know if they're going to be nice to me. I don't know if they're going to, work with me or yell at me or something. I've had cases where I've had people do that, and it's so difficult. And hopefully we can get somewhere with that, but as of right now, I don't even, it doesn't even look like it's going to be.
I can't even imagine how much of a challenge that must be. And, it brings to mind the thing that a lot of naysayers love to bring up. They're like, oh, well, mental health isn't real because it's all in your head. And it's like, yes, you're right. It is all in my brain, which is a real physical thing. So, yeah, actually, my mental health is directly linked to my physical health. So, similarly, mental and learning disabilities are no doubt reflections of just physical disabilities. So that very strange thing that people love to try and like split hairs and say, well, this one's legitimate and this one's just made. No, no, and that's a very weird thing to want to do, to try to make that distinction. Very strange, very, very strange.
I don't think it can be overstated how incredibly frustrating dealing with all of that is. I mean, there are times when I've had to spend literally my entire day on the phone, going back and forth between a doctor's office and a pharmacy and my insurance company, or a doctor and a service provider, the wheelchair providing company or the insulin providing company or whatever that happens to be. It can be incredibly draining. It can be incredibly frustrating. And to speak to what Aaron's saying in regards to mental health, there are times when, from the time I've gotten up and gotten myself something to eat, I've spent the rest of my day on the phone, and it feels like you're beating your head against a wall. Like I, told my boyfriend, it's sort of like, I got this one thing accomplished, and now I am done. I am finished for the day. I have nothing left. And I haven't even, what most people might think of, done anything. Because you've spent all of your time trying to advocate for yourself against a system that is not really designed for you to get the care that you need.
This is all such potent conversation. Something I want to come back to, actually, Jean, you had mentioned, when I had asked, like, oh, do you find events accessible? You had mentioned that sometimes it's a question of, like, where it is, but also who is there, and the consideration that they may give. Like, you had referenced Beyond Grommr the Seas. There were a couple of instances where maybe, oh, a place is not suitable for you, and then the collective was happy to say, well, that's fine, we won't go there then. Let's find somewhere that fits everyone. And I can imagine that creates a moment of levity and brevity, where you go, oh, whew, don't have to navigate people's moments and emotions in such a moment. But also, we were talking before about other aspects of community where people maybe can use ableist language about being the healthy fatty, or even other terminology in sex contexts. People love to reference people through teasing and insulting language, calling them pigs and whales and all sorts of things. Very common in the community. But I wonder if there is a point there about, when you'll reflect on your experiences with the community, is there something that the individual can do that would make your daily experience a little bit better, engaging with the community from an access perspective?
I would think, just more than anything, it's just people need to just kind of come in with a bit of a more open mind with things. I know it's, a little easier said than done, but I think if people can just approach and maybe just ask a few things before, going in and just assuming that's what the person's going to be into or how they feel about it, because everybody's so different. Everybody has a very different way how they approach gaining and how they feel about it with themselves, and whether it's intentional or accidental, or maybe they're just seeing how the flow of it goes. But I feel like communication is going to be our biggest asset, and that really goes across the board with everything. Talking and getting to know the person a little bit more. And I wish some of these places would also do a little bit better with larger print. That'd be great.
I think, to add to what Aaron shared, I think if there can be some really logistical information provided, like in the venue, parking is close by to the front door. There's about 100-yard walk from the parking to the front door. This is mobility chair / wheelchair accessible, wide aisles, bathroom has been looked at, and it's easily to navigate. Those kind of logistics can absolutely make a difference. Oh, and chairs without arms. All of these things, only has booths. I would hope that would never be the case. But these logistical planning elements could really be beneficial for those of us that, have physical access issues.
To add to what Phil's saying too, I think that's absolutely spot on. And I would suggest for folks who are planning events like, Grommr or the Grommr or whatever the case happens to be, maybe if possible, include a disabled person in your planning group for those events. It's all well and good for an able-bodied person standing on their own 2 feet to say, oh, there's a wheelchair symbol on the door. Looks like it should be fine. But if you haven't navigated that space in a wheelchair, you can't really know that. I would also recommend, both for able-bodied folks and folks with disabilities and chairs especially, there's a fantastic app, at least in the US, called Roll Mobility, that lets wheelchair users enter information about a particular business, and you can look up, say, a restaurant online, and there are reviews on there from actual wheelchair users, and it has certain pre-formatted questions like, is the bathroom wheelchair accessible? And then there will be more questions under that, like, is it regular wheelchair accessible? Is it power chair accessible? Is it wide chair accessible? Are the doors automatic? Are there multiple doors for entry? It's just these little things that, being able-bodied, you probably aren't going to think about, unless you're in a friend group with a disabled person or have a partner who's disabled or whatever the case is. And I don't mean that to shade anybody who's able-bodied. I understand that, I never thought about it before, and then you start to realize, like, oh, there are many small challenges that go along with having mobility restrictions that most people just simply are not going to think about. And, ADA compliance is great, but it is very technical down to the very inch. An ADA accessible bathroom means door is X inches wide. Well, that still doesn't accommodate everybody. That doesn't mean, okay, are there handrails? Are the sinks low enough and protrude so that someone in a chair can get up to the sink to properly wash their hands? And these are things that, again, you're just not going to think about. I think including someone in the planning of that, and just, reach out to a friend or reach out to the facility. If you're planning a Grommr, say, it's not necessarily as simple as going, oh, let's all meet at the Golden Corral because it's centrally located and everybody can get there and it's not too expensive. That's a good start, but there's more to think about.
You know what? I'm just jumping there real quick because all of y'all are from the America, where the meme exists that y'all are about £1,000 a piece, and the society is built for the wideness, which of course, as we're unpacking, is not necessarily the meme. But I am from Australia and now live in the UK, which is a part of Europe, and most of the facilities here are reclaimed from heritage buildings, which means there are a lot of narrow spaces, a lot of gaps and barriers and things that are just oddly shaped. I mean, I've developed a habit here in this country where I don't just casually look down as I walk. I stare at the steps and walk slowly down each step, because I have had multiple experiences of places that have stairs where the stairs are different shapes and sizes and heights and gradients and materials, which can be very slippery because people love a basement with just like a wet cement step. It is absolute batshit to me. But even at 200, 210, the amount of places I go where, like, as you mentioned, I think, Gene, if you go to a little family restaurant, and the amount of tables that are just so packed together that it is like, I can't move through this. And at my size, I can't finagle that. So I think it is worth every person to start to ask those questions about accessibility. Like, I have loved discovering that my butt has grown. So now that when I turn a certain corner, or if I scooch past something, oh no, my butt has knocked something off the thing. That must be happening because I'm getting bigger and wider. I've become accustomed to it. I love it, because when the scale tells me that I have not gained weight, my body says, no bitch, you are bigger and wider. And I'm like, yes, thank you very much. But also, maybe we can, as Gene was saying, take some of that energy and turn that into, well, what does this mean for people who are larger than I am? If I am beginning to see struggles of just the little things, how much more is that the case for people who are larger than me, for people who are wheelchair access, for people who have, vision impairment and grading and things of that nature? All very pertinent, I think. I think one of the questions we were going to ask is obesity a form of disability? And for all of y'all, it really seems the case that, you know, whether it's the gaining journey has created or exacerbated existing disabilities, or perhaps those disabilities pre-exist the experience, because regardless of where people fall on the particular of that, it doesn't matter because people still get treated poorly. But I want to use this opportunity to probe to y'all. Obviously, we've talked about it a little bit today, but has this kind of stirred up any other particular points in the conversation around gaining, fatness, and accessibility that maybe we haven't touched on yet?
I think that kind of also harkens back to the similar question that, queer rights activists have been fighting for decades, which is is it nature or nurture? And for me, the answer is who cares? If someone needs additional assistance, additional accessibility, as such additional accommodations, does it matter? I don't care if someone got fat on purpose or if they are naturally overweight, with air quotes, or whatever the case happens to be. We should be treating people the same regardless, as far as kindness and paying attention to folks' needs, whether that's because they chose to get fat or for another reason. It just doesn't matter. You still need the accommodation. You still need the wider aisle. You still need, the better access to a bathroom. You still need all of these things. Ultimately, I don't think it matters.
So to add to what Jean is saying, I think, well, initially, no, I don't think obesity means disability. I think for some, it means a state of fatness and it becomes an erotic issue. But looking at this from a more political fat liberation perspective, if we lived in a world that accommodated individuals that use wheelchairs and power chairs and scooters, and if that world was constructed in such a way that I could go every place in my chair, there wouldn't be the word disabled. That would no longer be a term used in society. If society accommodated me everywhere I went and it was a non-issue. So I think if we look at it from that view, then the world is not accessible enough for everyone. And again, that's looking at it from an entirely different lens, but I think it's important to note that.
Right. And I would have to say when it comes to, would it be considered a disability or not? I think it just really depends on the person and their perspective. For me, it was an accidental thing that happened with my partner. He gains weight incredibly easily. He's not a gainer by any means, but it's just how his body is made. And even my sister, because of her medical conditions, she's been having to gain weight too. But she and I are like perfectly fine with where we are. It doesn't, we don't think it's a bad thing. And I think it really just depends on the society itself and how they're viewing it. It's like, I personally don't see it as a thing that, like what Jean was saying, it's like, who really cares? It's a matter of just like what you need to do that's going to help you. And, to Phil's point, it's like society needs to understand that it's like we need more accessibility to things. And that's just going to make everything easier. And so it just depends on the person. It really does. So it's like, sometimes it's genetics, sometimes it's purposeful, but it's a matter of like, life has its twists and turns.
I think what you said before, Phil, was quite impactful. Like, in order for something to be considered a disability or for someone to be considered disabled, it is not a case of like contrasting that to someone who is quote unquote abled, but it's a question of access to society at large. So, in order for someone to be considered disabled, you are simply saying that society is not geared to give that person access. And so, simply creating a metric by which people with various access needs are adhered to, it changes the narrative of what it means to be a person with a disability or to address the concept of disability. And I think this is a big part of what today's episode is about. It's kind of broadening the scope of what is a person with a disability and how we instinctively and inappropriately a lot of the time treat people as such, how we need to expand our definition of things, and how we especially see fatness in relation to access and disability, ways in which perhaps there isn't a likeness, but ways of it's also totally different. and how it's different experiences. There's also not a monolithic experience. Oh, so and so experienced this, therefore I can also expect to experience this. Lots of different experiences, even amongst just the people speaking here today. And I think that's also another really important point to consider. Not just, oh, I spoke to one person, they said all this is good. Feel free to speak to multiple people. Feel free to get the perspective of many different people to get a more well-rounded understanding about whether or not something is quote-unquote good in that kind of a regard. I want to ask here, for those who engage with different resources, are there any that you might recommend to listeners, either in terms of further education, in terms of learning a little bit more about access and disability, or things that people maybe should bear in mind as they proceed on their gaining journeys?
I had mentioned a certain organization that I think is on the forefront of the fat liberation movement, and that is NAAFA, and that's NAAFA.org. They're very much group for everyone, and it is an amazing resource for individuals that are looking for fat-related resources. I will say there's a very non-gainer slant in NAAFA, and that they don't support or endorse feederism, but that's an entirely different subject.
I would say for anybody who's in the Ohio area, I know every state has their own group that you can go to, that Ohioans, like opportunities for Ohioans with disabilities is a great place to go. They can help you with different resources that you need, different, insurances, and helping you navigate through that. And also finding doctors who are going to be accepting of you, even if you are, overweight or, a gainer. Like I've met many people that is not an issue for them. So I would highly recommend checking out Ohio, opportunities for Ohioans with disabilities. They've made a huge difference for me.
I know I mentioned it previously. Again, I cannot highly enough recommend the Roll Mobility app for folks in the US. I believe it is available in Canada as well. I am not 100% sure on that, but I think that it is. Other than that, I think it's very easy to kind of jokingly say, well, everybody should just have a disabled friend. But truly, I can't undersell the fact that, when you have someone in your life who has challenges or mobility restrictions, or however you want to phrase it, you will start to look at these things differently. And I think that it would help folks, without disability, to just generally, when you're in public, be more aware of your surroundings, pay attention to these things, and honestly, too, watch out for folks with disabilities. I can't tell you the number of times I've been in the grocery store and had someone just fully slam a cart into my chair because they're not paying attention. They're on their phone. They're looking at a shelf. They're whatever. Be aware of your surroundings. Be aware of other people. And for God's sake, don't touch people's mobility devices without their permission.
Exactly. And to add to what Jean just said, I think it's important for those that are willing, be advocates in your universe. Advocate if you're in a facility and you notice something that makes something not accessible. Speak out, make it clear if there are no armless chairs, in your doctor's waiting room. Just speak out wherever you can and be an advocate, because you may make life easier not only for yourself, but for the next fatty coming along.
Tim, from your medical experience, do you have any suggestions for people who are looking to navigate the medical field, and maybe some advice in terms of considerations on disability access, especially for the larger folks?
I mean, if you do find yourself in a position where you have to live a differently abled life and you're worried about your income, your insurance, I mean, I know quite a few people who apply for supplemental Social Security insurance, SSI, and they do usually end up getting it. So, I've known several people who they can't work a normal job, so they get money every month, and I believe they also get Medicaid through it, which is actually sometimes a better system than privatized insurance, and only because you do get things quicker when it's Medicaid versus private insurance. So just be aware of that, and I guess beyond that, just pay attention to your body. I know we've talked a lot in this episode about people who like the eroticism of kind of like trashing their body and reaching certain milestones, but you're going to miss your knees when they don't work anymore. And you have to approach it with enough realism and sensibility to be like, is that okay with me? If I gain enough weight and something happens to me and say I can't get around like I used to anymore, am I all right with that? Can I live with that? Because I don't think enough people ever consider that.
100. And my only piece of advice to listeners would be listen to the people in your life who have access needs. Listen to the people on this podcast, follow them, and take note of the people in your life who also share some of these experiences, or maybe their experiences are totally different. Listen to them and be considerate of those things. When you go and take them out for a coffee, ask them the question of like, is this place accessible for you? Is this good for you? And then maybe that's a good first step for a lot of us who haven't been too well aware of the access needs in the community, is being aware enough to just ask and be more considerate of people's active needs. But I think that brings us to the end of this episode. This is a very powerful episode. I want to say a huge thank you to Jean, to Phil, to Aaron, all of you for being a part of this today. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Yes, great to be here as always.
Fabulous. Now, where can our listeners find you online?
You can find me on Grommr at Blubrboy, Blubroboy, or on Instagram at AnonBear2021.
You can find me on Grommr as uncannyphoenix, or on Instagram or BlueSky as mxjeangrey.
I am only on Grommr, but my username on there is fattanetta. So you're always welcome to hit me up on there.
Well, that brings us to the end of another exciting episode here on Thicc Radio. Please remember to like and subscribe, rate us 5 stars, and leave us a good review. Now, if you liked this episode, the podcast, or just us in general, please share it with your friends and encourage them to tune in. You can find me on Instagram and BlueSky at stannnum.
And you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and TikTok at ThiccMouse. You can also look us up on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok at Thicc Radio, or at our website at podpage.com/thiccradio. If you want to submit a voice note or become a financial supporter of the show, you can find the links in the show notes, and you can always write to us at thiccradio@gmail.com. So until next time, bye, Fats.
Bye, Fats.
Bye,
Fats.
Let's talk about it.
Thicc Radio is a Patreon and Enter app podcast produced by Stan and Thicky Mouse.
Mixed and mastered by stannnum.
Our artwork is provided by Lokitu.
Our theme song is provided by Body by Cream.